Hello, beautiful people. My name is AnnMarie, and I am the host of What Would You Miss? What Would You Miss is a small conversation that means everything. Join us for a conversation about suicide prevention. All right, we have Missy with us today with the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention.
Thank you.
Which I think is one of the most important conversations to start this off with, because language and stigma and, perpetuating that stigma is what we need to stop. So, Missy, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm so excited. Let's talk a little bit about, first, the difference between being sad and being depressed.
Absolutely.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a really important distinction when we talk about things like depression and anxiety, because everybody at some point in their life is going to have things that are not going so great, where it could be a bad day, bad week, a number of situations that may be going on that are causing you stress, causing you sorrow, grief. That's a natural part of being a human,
Absolutely.
right? Just like there's a lot of things that will cause us worry or stress. And so that's something that happens very often. The difference is when it really starts to impact negatively and get in the way of your day-to-day.
Right.
When you can't shake it off, when the things that normally you would go to cheer you up or perk you up or, try to move through, perhaps those things are no longer serving you in the way they once were. But, and there's really not a hard or fast rule. We sometimes say if you have, several of these symptoms on a list and it's 2 or more weeks, but it's not really a very specific thing. It's something to keep in mind as a guideline to notice these changes in mood and behavior. But really it's when it starts to impact work, school, relationships, even just taking care of yourself. It's certainly worth the conversation to see, could this be something more serious like depression?
Right. And one thing I always like to say is, being sad is an emotion. We can
Yes.
get through that. Just like we can, when we're angry, we can get through that. But being depressed is a clinical diagnosis.
Yes.
And that is, it can require treatment, whether that be medication or just therapy. You said something, the things that cheer you up, I call that my emotional reserve.
Yes.
I like to keep a list on my phone of things that I can tap right into. The problem is that if I don't practice them daily, when I'm in crisis, they're not going to do anything for me.
Yeah.
And, I think that's something that we need to start teaching society and, our kids and, even our spouses and our loved ones, just there are things that you can do to help yourself.
Absolutely.
So, I started What You Would Miss. And I called you up. We have a great connection. Our friend Jess, who runs a crisis hotline out in Buffalo. One day I was sitting there and I started thinking about things that, that kind of sucked in my life. And then it started making me think about things that I would miss. And I realized it wasn't what people would think. It's not my family or my dog, or my kids, or it's me. I would miss singing in the car, and I would miss, being inappropriate and dancing in the elevator, and, all those things that make me uniquely me. And what I realized was it gave me worth. And what gave me worth gave me hope. And I think with suicide prevention, having hope is a really big thing, don't you think?
Absolutely. That is one of the words that AFSP we use so much, and we really try to incorporate, because it's true, it's something that brings us all together in this work. Everybody comes to the work around suicide prevention for a number of very personal and individual reasons. For some people, it's one very particular reason, such as the loss of somebody important to them. But a lot of people, it might be multiple losses, or it could be attempts supporting somebody who struggles, or for their own struggle, right? And so, but one thing that really keeps us all together in this work, though, is hope. It's just that. And I love how you talk about the items that we really try to focus on through What Would You Miss? Because those are what we call in the field protective factors, is what are the things that are in place in your life that we need to pay closer attention to and make sure we're fostering them. Like if it was a garden, we want to make sure we're watering and feeding them, right? So then they can flourish and produce. And the protective factors, those things that create a strong foundation for us that will help us weather the storms that are inevitably going to happen, right?
Exactly.
We need that strong foundation, but we need to make sure we're taking the steps to build those and maintain them along the way.
Right. And, all those things that, if we don't feel worthy, we're not going to have any hope. Like they just go together. It really, they meld together perfectly. And, that brings me to what that question does, what would you miss? It's so small, but it's so immense. I found when I started asking people that, it wasn't just people who were struggling
Yeah.
or people who, who had attempts. It were people who were grieving the loss of someone they loved, because it gave them a chance to talk about that person who died by suicide, because the truth is that person who died by suicide was something more than that.
Yes.
And it gives them a chance to really tell their story. And then for me, who, I've lived with depression and anxiety my entire life, I have suicide attempts, I live with suicidal thoughts, it gave me a chance to actually talk about it in a real gentle way, so that the conversation, it wasn't uncomfortable, because we know if someone's uncomfortable, we're not going to talk about
Absolutely.
it. But it also, what it did was, I had this really cool thing happen. My friends were texting me when I started the whole thing and telling me things that they missed about me. And that made me feel so good. So I took this little question and it made it everything.
Yeah. It's amazing. And I think it's the power of conversation
Right.
and talking more openly about it. And that's a really big thing that, we're about too with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And that's why I think, this connection was made between the two of us to have this conversation, because it is more about talking about it. We need to bring, these different thoughts and issues and concerns more into the light, just like we have other health stuff, right? I know that cancer has been part of your story. But decades ago, no one talked about cancer, right? If someone had a diagnosis, it was super hush hush, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And now people proudly walking around showing a bald head saying, I am a cancer survivor, I'm a warrior, right? What a change that's been. So we need to get to that point with mental health. We're really on the cusp of that. We're seeing more momentum where people are coming and sharing their stories of loss, of struggle, of grief, right? But we also have people who perhaps haven't experienced something like a suicide in their life, or an attempt, but they may be struggling. They may be having a hard time. Things are starting to really pile up for them. We want to help them. We don't want to get to a point of a crisis, right? We need to do more to really cut it off at the pass before we get to a point where people are even starting to have those suicidal ideations or thoughts or feelings of desperation. So everybody can be served by having these conversations honestly about what's going on inside of us.
It truly, the only way to prevent anything is to talk about it. There's no cure here.
Right.
So we do have to have a conversation. And I have a really good friend who does great work in the suicide prevention world, and he has a saying, and I think it resonates so deeply with me, and it's awareness, memes, positive quotes. They don't help anyone. They really truly don't. People save people. And the only way we can save and help each other is through conversation and safe conversation.
Yes.
This is something that I really want to talk about with you, because, our society has really kind of did a number on the mental health community. It's a joke. It's, CSI, all those crime shows, the person committing the crime is usually someone with a mental illness, when in truth, people with a mental illness are 10 times more likely to be the victim of the crime.
Absolutely.
This is what our society has done to the mental health community, and we need to change that. I never have been really big about language. I really felt as though we needed to, serve the purpose first, but I feel like with mental health, we have got to change that language. We just had to, because the stigma around it is so heavy. What are some of the safe words that American Foundation of Suicide Prevention really, is pushing, and I totally agree with?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, because the thing is language does matter. If we're having a conversation, how do we converse is through language, through the words we use, right? And the words we use help set the tone for that conversation. It can be as simple as, when we ask directly about if someone is having suicidal thoughts, is that the way you ask somebody can really shut the conversation down right away. So for example, if I was your doctor, we're having an intake appointment, right? Like I'm your primary care, and they go through the list of all the stuff during a checkup, right? They ask now more and more about, are you having thoughts of depression or anxiety, or are you having suicidal thoughts? And they ask directly and clearly. But there are still some folks, even at a professional level, that will say it in such a way, and let me give you the example of, you're not thinking about killing yourself, are you?
Right.
What does that do to that person who's on the other side being asked that question, who perhaps has been having suicidal thoughts?
Well, I'll tell you, just hearing that and having suicidal thoughts immediately made me think, oh God, I don't want to tell them, because if I tell them, they're going to, think X, Y, and Z.
Exactly. This isn't a person who wants to hear the answer. Right. That is the message that comes across. Whether or not we intentionally mean to do that when we're asking, It does indicate we're really uncomfortable with this topic. We're getting through this question just to get through it and check that off my list and move on to treating your sinus infection or whatever you're there for, right? But that shuts down an opportunity where this person who's right in front of me as my patient could actually really be dealing with this, right? We know when somebody presents themselves in a doctor's office, yeah, probably it's for one specific thing, but we are not single issue humans or individuals, right? We always have something, multiple things swirling around inside of us.
Please,
at
have
any
you seen
given
my,
time.
my mental health and my
Exactly,
physical rap sheet?
right?
No one
Exactly.
wants that.
Yes. And so you're like, you need to set aside a couple hours for intake, right?
Right.
But it's an opportunity for example, when we're talking about primary care, right? There is an opportunity where we can start to have a guided conversation about their overall well-being.
Right.
But it doesn't have to just be at a professional or medical setting. And I think that's something we really try to get across as well. It's not just up to the doctors and to the mental health professionals to be able to have these conversations, because guess what? There's not enough people to go around to do that, right? We really need to educate people in the community to help them to know they can have these types of conversations with each other. But even in terms of just the language they use when we do refer to things like suicide, or we refer to mental health conditions such as depression or anxiety, right? We are very, it's very embedded in our language to even throw words around like crazy, insane, nuts, right? We say that about like, oh, this traffic is just crazy today, or oh, this snow is insane. And we don't think anything about it, right? But this is where it does take that power away, and we also can be really dismissive of things that we don't understand or we fear and call them crazy or insane or ridiculous, or and be very dismissive of them. And so those are some things too in terms of ways we can start to chip away at the stigma that's involved with mental health, because we wouldn't make these kinds of phrases about other health conditions that people struggle with.
No, actually, I heard a news report once, and it said the weather today is so bipolar.
Right.
And I have a son who is bipolar, and he was like, "What do they mean by that?" He was so like annoyed by it, and I was
Right.
proud of him for being annoyed, because he should be. But
Yeah.
there's something that I think is really important to discuss: is having suicidal thoughts is not the same thing as being suicidal. They're two different things. You can have those thoughts. I mean, and with depression, suicidal thoughts really do come hand in hand. It's just part of it, I believe. But having an actual suicide plan is a little different. And I think that's another part that society just doesn't understand, that, if I come to you and say that I'm, feeling like I have some suicidal thoughts, it's not the same as saying I have a suicidal plan.
Right.
High risk is different. So talk about the risk a little bit. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, for sure. And I think it is true that having suicidal thoughts there's kind of a spectrum there, right? It may not mean that you actively have a plan, or that you're actively in a crisis.
Right.
There are some people who live with more kind of chronic or passive suicidality. And so, but there's times where it can be very impulsive and a very, very quick kind of turnaround. But oftentimes it is people who it's been kind of building for them, right? And it's becoming more and more prevalent part of their day-to-day. And that's where, again, the more that we can do to educate and have conversations kind of earlier when somebody's starting to struggle, and to be aware of what are the risk factors and warning signs, so we can reach out before it gets to a point that they are feeling so desperate, making a plan, making provisions, for their life, and so, or for the end of their life rather. Certainly it's important to be aware of risk factors. None of us are 100% immune to the risk of suicide, just like none of us are 100% immune to any health
Right.
issue or crisis potentially, right? But we know there are certain kind of guidelines or things that help us be more aware that I might be at an elevated risk, for example, of, cancer or heart disease, and that actually is one of the risk factors is family history. I think people, we're still just getting better at even knowing our own family history for many health issues. Recognizing that doesn't necessarily mean you will absolutely get that disease or develop that condition just because your mom or your grandparents did, right? But it does give you more information to talk with your doctor, to make a plan for how are we going to kind of monitor, am I progressing towards potentially, developing this condition? But there's when it comes to mental health, there's certainly family history, but we tend to not talk about that, right? It's only now as we tend to learn about signs and symptoms that we kind of piece together, like, that explains a lot probably about grandpa, right?
Right.
That kind of explains it. We can't go back in time and diagnose, people who have passed on, but it does really tell the story,
It
right?
sheds a little light
It
on
sheds
it,
a little
for
light
sure.
on it. It gives some perspective. But wouldn't it be great if we can talk more openly with our family members and especially our kids, right? About what we're going through, because there is a chance that if you struggle with depression, that your kids may have some experiences with it. And the same goes with suicide loss. A risk factor for suicide is having a close proximity to one. And so again, doesn't mean that you automatically will. It's not a be all end all rule, but certainly having a close tie or touch with either the loss of somebody else or your own history of attempts does increase your risk moving forward.
And you did talk about signs, and signs are important, and I think that they are definitely red flags, but there are those non-signs.
Yeah.
And I have a saying which I know it goes around the internet. It's ask your strong friends, ask your happy friends. You're saying it, and I hear it in your conversation just now. No one is immune to this.
Right.
So we do need to ask the question. How's your mental health? How
Yeah.
are you? And I have to say, I don't believe that what would you miss is the cure, but it has brought an easy conversation to a lot of families.
Yeah.
I've had parents message me and say, I just tried this with my child because I could tell that they were struggling. And, I had a mom that messaged me and she said, I went through this whole list of things that her son, she found annoying about her son. He slams the door, he leaves the milk on the counter, and, she told him she would miss all this if he wasn't here. And the son messaged her later that day and said, Mom, I didn't think you would miss me at all. And if we that brought such a gentle
Absolutely.
conversation to the table, and we do need to talk.
Right.
Before we kind of start wrapping things up, I'd love for you to give me a couple statistics, because I think numbers are important to
Yeah.
people. Right now, what is the suicide rate? Like, what is the average age range, and is it male or female?
All of the above.
Right.
And I think that's when we talk just overall in terms of generalities, in terms of looking across all demographics, all backgrounds, suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in this country. Wow. So 47,000 people die each year by suicide. And so that is more than war, natural disasters, and homicides combined. Right? These are things that we pay a lot of attention to, and we have a lot of initiatives around, a lot of support and resources, right, to try and combat
Absolutely.
those. But more people collectively are dying by suicide. It is something that, of course, those stats will vary state by state, county by county, and it is something, though, that does impact across the lifespan. However, you'll find that while different demographic groups, because of their more individual risk factors, will have their own rates, still it is middle-aged white men, straight middle-aged white men,
And
who are
men
the
don't want
number
to
one.
talk, because
Right.
we know how strong they are.
Well, and I think that's part of the stigma part too,
Right.
right? When we talk about stigma, is that about the willingness to accept help, the not wanting to seem weak. These are all parts of our language that we still have embedded, right? Or these are these myths, these perceptions that are powerful, because those give powerful messages to other men.
Right.
And that's been really amazing, is to see more and more, is to see these middle-aged men, especially start to have these conversations. We have people more in media, in sports, who are starting to stand up and talk about their own mental health struggles. Athletes especially.
Athletes especially,
has been
yes.
really incredible, because again, they're supposed to be tough, strong, heroes, right? They have it all, right? But they struggle. Being a professional athlete is incredibly, incredibly tough.
The suicide rate
Yeah.
amongst professional athletes is actually very, very high.
Yeah.
I've worked with the NFL a little bit, and what happens is that they were football players in high school. They were stars of their team, and then they went off to the NFL, and they're stars there too.
Yeah.
And then their career's over with, and now who are they?
Yeah.
And that
And they're so
identity.
young.
Oh, they're so young. And
Yeah.
and I've seen some great teams. I know the Miami Dolphins, being one of them,
Yeah.
are doing really great reform projects.
Yeah.
Doing internships to really rehabilitate athletes after
Yeah.
they come out. But men is such an issue.
Yeah.
A friend of mine's husband died by suicide a couple years back, and I recently shared a picture of him, and he was fishing, and she had this great quote with it. It reached 72% men, and that made such an impact on me, because I said to myself, wow, guys really do want to talk.
They do.
We just need to say to them, hey, you know what? Being strong means asking for help too.
Yeah, and accepting help. And I think part of it can be educating men on how to reach out to their friends. Because, not to speak in generalities, but we kind of have to, is that to be able to have a guy reach out to a fellow guy versus you or me start that conversation
Right.
with them, right? And so because they're going to communicate and understand each other's experiences in different ways. And so the more we're seeing people really take leadership in business and community and wherever is huge. And I think that's part of, in terms of the language we use, is making sure that we're breaking down some of those walls and letting people know that it's okay, and that just because we've said that you have to be tough in a certain way, this is actually an incredible display of strength to talk openly about your mental health struggles. That is an incredible amount of bravery and strength, honestly. So you talk about heroes and bravery and courage. Getting through the day-to-day when you're struggling with depression is an incredible act of courage. So we need to reframe that conversation around men especially. And when it comes to women, they tend to be the ones who, when you say, check on your strong friend, they put up the whole, like, it's fine, I'm fine. You know, we know when a woman says, I'm fine.
Fine's my sentence.
Yeah.
If I ever say I'm fine, you better call in the troops.
Exactly.
Let me tell
it
you.
means I'm not fine, right? But we know that, you know, women will tend to try and take on everyone else's burdens, be the caregivers, and why, right? Again, these are barriers that have been put up over time that we need to break down, right? And so being able to have friends that can look out for other friends, and there is a quote too, and our friend Jessica actually I think shared it the other day, is just because they carry it well doesn't mean it isn't heavy,
I
right?
love that quote.
And I think that really sums up well about our strong friends, is that everybody has something going on under the surface. And if it's someone, especially, think about, and this is a challenge for anyone listening to this podcast right now, is think about someone who, you know, you haven't talked to in a little while, right? And even if you see each other in social media, it seems like things are great, kids are good, right? Going on vacation, had Christmas. Reach out and just say, hey, how have you been doing? I was just thinking about you and I miss you, and just, you know, just wondering how things are going, if you're doing okay. And
A
so
simple hi goes really
absolutely.
far. It really
and
does.
to not assume just because we put on a good front that and it doesn't mean that you're being fake necessarily. It just means that you're not letting the full load of what's
Right.
going on out to the world, right?
Well, one tip that I do, I think is important, and would be great for this for people listening to this, is I use emojis. So I have friends that we have a code emoji.
Yes.
And if I send my friend a pickle, they know that I'm in a pickle.
Yeah.
And I need help. And
Yeah.
it's a great way to ask for help without
Yes.
really asking for help.
Absolutely.
You know, thank you so much for being a part of this, the first podcast.
Thank
it's
you
like
so
so
much.
important to have you here, especially because of your work that you're doing. Like, you know, one thing that I think is really important is if anyone is in crisis, they should text 741-741.
Absolutely.
You know, get the help that you need. There's resources out there, and you know, more importantly, have a conversation with someone that you love.
For
What would you
sure.
miss?
Yes.
It's a simple sentence, but it really does mean everything.
It does. And if I can do a quick plug for our website,
please.
afsp.org. So if you need some additional guidelines, any of our listeners, for how to start that conversation, right? That we have tips on what to do, what not to do, how to kind of open it up versus shut it down. And so we really want to encourage everyone to really take a moment to educate themselves on that and how to reframe. And just a little simple choice of words can make a world of difference.
Absolutely. And there's different chapters, right? That's the national page, and then there's different
Yeah,
chapters
absolutely.
locally.
Exactly. And through that site, you can search for where you are based, and you can find the local chapter where you can get involved, where you can get connected and help us really make an impact.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, AnnMarie.
There's someone sitting in your chair. I wonder why you didn't take your seat. I look around and you're not there. And I'm the someone in your chair.